First of all, can I just say a personal thank you to everyone that voted for this one this week. I would have really struggled to write the script for why scuba is perfect for the studying person. But you guys voted for shore dives. I can write about that. So scuba diving has to take place in water, obviously, and there are two ways of getting into said water, either from the beach or from a boat. So boats have their benefits because you can go straight to the dive site on your boat, and the boat can then come pick you up and then take you to another dive site during your surface interval. But the whole point of scuba diving is just exploration, and if you have all of your own kit, you can go pretty much anywhere you like and go scuba dive. Just make sure that you won't get arrested because you've swam into a navy yard like James Bond, or bump into a ferry because you've swam into a shipping lane. You can't dive anywhere, but you can dive a lot of places. So shore diving is how many scuba divers get to dive sites, and there's a natural reason for this. The further away you get from shore, the deeper the ocean gets, and we can only go so deep as recreational scuba divers. Most stuff that's actually worth looking for is in shallowish water, because that's where the sunlight and the warmth actually is. The further out to sea you get, the more just bare sand and silt you're gonna find. You can find the odd sort of pinnacle or sort of island out to sea with some interesting stuff, but many dive sites are pretty close to land, so you can just kind of rock up in your pickup truck, sling your tank on your back, and in you go. But are shore dives really that good? First of all, let's look at the bad. So the problem with shore dives is that very little happens right next to shore, in like the first 100 meters or so, and it can take a while before you get to any real depth if the shore has a really shallow angle. So right at the beginning of your dive, you have to either submerge and waste some gas just looking at sand, or you have to surface swim out and then descend when you reach the right place, if you can actually find it without a buoy. So the same for at the end of the dive. With a boat, you just send up an SMB and there's a boat there waiting for you to pick you up. On a shore dive, you send an SMB up so a boat doesn't hit you on the surface, and you then have to swim all the way back to where you started, or at least back to shore, and then walk back to your car or the dive center with all of your kit because the currents dragged you down the shoreline. Walking into and out from the water can be a little bit awkward when you're fully kitted up, and that's the main problem. You have to be fully kitted up before you get near the water. If you're lucky, this is quite a short walk to the water from a beach where there's a bench that you can set up on. Worst case, the dive center is across the street, you know, through a restaurant, and then you have to traipse through it in your wetsuit and then your tank on your back as well. And oh, you look nice today, madam. Pardon me. Oh, the fish cakes are nice here. They're nice and fresh. But dive gear is lovely and neutrally buoyant in the water, so you don't feel the weight of it. That is until you climb out of the water and regret strapping that twin set onto your back because they're heavy. Then when you actually get to the water, you have to keep walking and wading through the water until you're at least waist deep before you can even start putting your fins on. And this part of the dive sucks, as waves just kind of push you around and you're kind of buoyant, but if you try to sit down, you kind of like hit the bottom, then you float up a little bit, and then you roll over into your front as you try and put your fins on. But then you have to keep wading and sort of waddling deeper into water until you finally get to water deep enough that you can actually swim in. Coming back, you almost need to do the opposite. You swim as far as you can inland before standing up and taking your fins off as waves kind of push you around again. You then have to clamber out of the surf like the creature from the Black Lagoon on your hands and knees as you stagger back through the restaurant again as sand kind of sticks to your feet, and all you want to do is just take that darn weight belt off. And you have to apologize because the restaurant ran out of fish cakes. You need to learn about tides if you're shore diving. If you start the dive on the wrong tide, you're gonna have a really bad day. If you pick low tide, then you have a fairly long walk to even reach the water, but nearby wrecks and reefs will be much shallower, which is nice, so you can stay there for longer. But tides can actually limit the times when you can actually go diving. On a boat, you can usually just anchor up somewhere you need to, but shore diving, you need to be a bit more switched on to tide movements and what time of day it is and what it will be at the beginning and both at the end of the dive. Outgoing tides can just ruin visibility because it just drags sand from the shore and just kind of stirs it all up, and depending on where you are, it can create a pretty wicked riptide that just drags you out to sea, which is really dangerous. It's best that you learn about the local area and work out when your slack tides are, and sort of water movement is kept to a minimum, and that way you're more likely to have a good dive and make it back to where you started your dive. But of course, let's look at the good side of shore diving. So you don't need to organize a boat and all of the fuel and things that come with boats when shore diving. It's also a cost that's saved because you don't need to either buy a boat or hire one with a skipper that you can trust. If there's a decent shore dive nearby with good enough parking, you can just kit up and go. You don't have to organize quite as much if you just want to go for a last minute dive. You can also all go diving. You don't have to leave a designated diver on the surface just looking after the boat. You can all go diving together. You can pick a surface support that stays on the shore if you want to play it safe, but it's not as essential. If you live near the coast and don't fancy all the intricacies and costs of owning a boat, then scuba diving is a pretty convenient hobby. And if your local area allows it, you can also forage for some fresh seafood. So boats are cool and all, but they can be a right pain at times because you can't just put them in the water just anywhere, and if you leave them in the water, then you have to pay mooring fees, and then they just get grubby and they need even more maintenance. So if you can dive without a boat, it's a lot simpler. You don't spend that much time just bobbing around on a boat or on the surface if you suffer from seasickness on shore dives. If you want to, you can just swim underwater to and from the dive site, and sort of 5 meters under the surface, it doesn't matter what's happening up there on the surface, it's really calm and still underwater. I've known divers who have been fine on the dive, just cruising around a wreck, but as soon as they sort of hit the surface and they're waiting for the boat to kind of pick them up, it's just set off their seasickness and they felt proper rough. The only time rough weather or waves affects you on a shore dive is right at the beginning and right at the end. And even then, it's more just kind of like pushing you around instead of that constant swaying which sets you off. Out at sea, the water movement kind of rocks you gently, which sets most people off, but close to shore, it's usually just movement in one direction, which granted is annoying getting pushed around, but it doesn't really set your seasickness off. You can decompress gradually with something to actually look at on your safety stop. Because you're not having to hover in mid-water waiting for your computer to count down to 0, if you need to do a safety stop at 5 meters, then you get to 5 meters depth and either sit there or you can sort of swim along the bottom at 5 meters. That way you have a really good visual reference of your depth and you can't sink down any deeper, and it's really obvious if you start to float up towards your ceiling. Just sitting on a trapeze or at the end of an SMB spool can get really old fast with nothing to do but look out at the open ocean. But if you can play a quick game of noughts and crosses in the sand or kind of stack some rocks up and see how tall you can get it, that really passes the time much faster. It also keeps you in a much more horizontal position and you decompress more evenly compared to if you're upright, where your head decompresses basically faster than your feet. Because you're along the bottom, you tend to stay flat during your safety stop, where many divers just end up upright, just putting their feet down. But bear in mind that your feet are now a few feet deeper than your head, so they're under a greater pressure and they're actually decompressing slower. So shore diving can arguably be safer because you're decompressing more evenly because you're less likely to decompress in an upright position. Getting all of your dive kit out and strolling into and out from the ocean feels like you're in the right stuff. To regular beachgoers and dog walkers, you in all of your technical gear just look awesome, and you turn a few heads as you and your mates just all walk slowly in a straight line into the ocean. Just, you know, try not to stumble and fall over and just ruin that effect. Now, you will get asked what you're doing by that old guy who's out for his daily walk, and at that point, you can pretty much make up whatever you like. Even the truth is pretty awe-inspiring that you're going to go dive a World War II shipwreck, but hey, it could be a Cold War nuclear submarine for all they know. You can tell them that you're off to dive a crashed satellite or a Spanish galleon that's full of gold and jewels surrounded by sharks.
You've done that, haven't you?
You will instantly be the most interesting people on the beach, strolling past the metal detectors and the guys with their stunt kites as you pressurize your scuba diving rig and wetsuit and checking everything's working, and then at the end of the dive you just appear out of the depths out of nowhere. They don't have to know that all you've seen for the past 10 minutes is just sand and seaweed. So shore dives can be very cool. Sure, there are some downsides, but I've done my fair share of shore dives and I'll never turn my nose up at a shore dive. Sure, boat dives are very convenient once you're actually on them, but if you live near a dive site, then shore dives are fine. But given the choice, are you a boat diver or a shore diver? Would you invest more to dive a site by boat, or would you prefer to just swim a little bit more from shore and dive the exact same site? Let's discuss below. Thank you for watching, and of course, safe diving. So it's important to spend a little bit of time with your buddy so that you're both on the same wavelength when it comes to talking underwater, because you can have literal different languages when it comes to hand signals. Now, we're not particularly elitist here at Simply Scuba, but on that note, here are the best dive signals to use.